Hey, it's time for another movie review, and today I'm going to review a 2020 movie called Eternal Beauty. It was directed by Craig Roberts, and he was responsible for the screenplay. And the cast in the lead role: Sally Hawkins plays Jane, David Toulis plays Mike, Billy Piper plays Jane's sister, Nicola. Morphy Clark plays Jane as a very young woman. Penelope Wilton plays Vivian, Jane's mother. Alice Lowe plays Jane's sister, Alice. Robert Pure is Dennis. And Jane's lover, his voice only, is heard by Robert Aramayo. Okay. Right, now to the awards. It wasn't that well received, this movie. However, it did get some interest in the BAFTA awards in Wales, where it won for Best Costume Design, and there were nominations for editing and for Best Actress for Sally Hawkins and Best Production Design. It was also recognised at the Beijing International Film Festival, where it was nominated for Best Film for Craig Roberts. And finally, at the British Independent Film Awards, it got a nomination for Sally Hawkins for Best Actress. Director Craig Roberts brings to the screen a very humane drama about mental illness. It's in the 1980s. You know that because you can see red payphones on the streets. Also, the clothes are very glaring with colourful schemes. Sally Hawkins plays Jane, a young woman experiencing depression and schizophrenia following the trauma of being stood up at the altar. We get a flashback to that day where Morphy Clark, who plays a younger Jane, is preparing for that day. And Jane suffers from mood swings. She hears voices, and she has very much a bullying mother. And her sister is also quite prone to lay into her verbally. However, her sister Alice is much more sympathetic and possibly her only friend and ally. Her life appears to turn around when she meets another patient, Mike, played by David Toulis. But this whirlwind romance sets off alarm bells with her family and brings a different set of problems. It's a black comedy of sorts, sometimes quite disturbing. Jane's lonely and bewildering world we see clearly. And although she is quite tender, the movie is very moving, and it really goes down the road of self-healing. Jane is a very jittery person, however, but the film does enable the viewer, I think, to have a sympathetic and emotional connection with the vulnerability of Hawkins's character. We see Jane walking towards her home, and she walks past a phone box, and the phone's ringing. It's a run-down council estate for sure. And of course the phone is a fire engine red. It's the same as the one in Jane's apartment on the day when she was jilted at the altar. And so therefore we then get into a flashback to that fateful day when the man she loved left her numb at the altar. So one questions as a viewer, is that call in the past, a flashback, or perhaps a more subjective memory, or maybe both? Anyway, we do see Jane as a younger woman in a wedding gown, and we also witness the shock when she's told that the groom hasn't appeared at the church. I'm going to look at some of the scenes that had an impact on me. And the first one then, Jane goes to visit her psychiatrist. This happens regularly in her life, and we see her with this very unsympathetic quack who scolds her for answering fine when she asks how she's doing. He clearly wants the answer to be better. He wants her to be like the picture on the wall of a person at a beach enjoying the water lapping against the sand. His answer to her superficial fine is to adjust her medication. And this gives you some insight, really, as to how mental health is handled in the UK without a great deal of sensitivity. It's a painful scene for sure. And then we see another when she visits her family for Christmas. She's brought a number of gifts and she hands these out to the family members. The difference is that the gifts are for her and she's actually taken the trouble to get them in advance to enable her family not to complain bitterly about trying to find presents for her. It's all rather amusing at first, but rather a shock, really. And it just gets to the heart of the lack of feeling and absence of joy in this family by this sequence on Christmas Day. And Jane, seeing it as very convenient to the family members, then witnesses them giving it to her. But she does point out that she would like them to pay for the cost of the gift. But certainly, as family dysfunction goes, this is probably quite up there. And it certainly sets the tone, really, of this film. Jane's ongoing psychiatric trauma is a theme throughout, of following the shattering happening at the church. And this scene is certainly highlighting that. Farce on Christmas Day with that part of her family. Jane then moves to her other sister Alice, where at least we get a degree of normalcy. Alice is married and has a family, and so we see a glimpse of what a normal Christmas might be. I was impressed with Hawkins, as I am with most of her work. She shows her acting talents by expressing typical reactions and emotions that psychiatric patients have, living in a false reality, regressive childlike behaviour, and periods when they are simply in a world of their own. The gulf between family is illustrated when Jane's mother informs her daughter that she has a serious illness, but it's delivered in such a way, in a manner and where it's almost swept away under the carpet without any notion of emotional feeling or reaction from either of them. Sister Nicola briefly captures centre stage in the movie when she decides to try and claim an allowance on psychiatric grounds, clearly a fraud, and she calls on Jane's support to rehearse behaviours, delusions, visual hallucinations, etc., in a hope that that will secure the signature from the psychiatric community nurse who has to do an assessment. This captures in a nutshell how the family see Jane and also how self-centred they are. The musical score also adds more weight to this, as it throws up perception very much of sort of madness with the sounds that are exhibited. In the past, through flashback and in the here and now, the director gives examples of Jane's erratic behaviour and responses to events. There's one incident where she's driving and she basically has to react very quickly because she's fiddling with the glove compartment, and it leads to her nephew who's in the car without a seatbelt on bumping her head. Her reaction to this is completely over the top, and her reaction to siblings using her clothes is also quite extreme. And this we see when she was a younger girl and then received a smack from her mother. We then move on to the next phase with the introduction of Mike, played brilliantly by David Toulis. He's a fellow patient who who enters into Jane's life, meeting in the office of the psychiatrist. Clearly see that both are very lonely. And loneliness is a big problem in the life of psychiatric patients. And society has historically imposed very strict controls over their behaviour when they become a couple, when the issue of a sexual relationship is desired. Nowadays, the typical medical controls of the past, which was preventing reproduction of children, has changed some slightly. But the forced sterilisation was quite a dramatic impact by society on the psychiatrically ill years ago. However, it has to be said that even at this juncture, the fact that they are a couple is frowned upon considerably, and certainly they aren't blessed with any acceptance by either the services that are providing Jane with care or her family. In this movie, we see the resistance to their relationship. I was fascinated by both actors in a dialogue between them in Mike's flat. It's definitely a highlight in the character acting, and we're asked to sort of view the conversation in terms of how much of it is reality and how much is fantasy, and it gets top billing as you try to unravel what is what. It's also got an accompanying 50s rock and roll sequence, and there's also some dancing which illustrates how the couple are actually opening up inside and enjoying themselves. They become engrossed in their own little world, flirting a little bit like young teenagers would do. But there's also a comedic aspect to the scene. And then moving on, we then see a family meal where Mike is invited. And this is a riveting watch as we witness the group dynamics on show with the family and Mike. And Mike tends to go somewhat over the top, exaggerating the truth to try and impress them. His imagination is definitely a star turn. Partners, however, isn't just restricted to Jane and Mike. Nicola later arrives with news that her boyfriend has died unexpectedly. And then we witness a scene, possibly in Jane's dream, not quite sure, where she catches Mike and Nicola copulating. Now, whether this is fantasy or reality, it dooms Jane's relationship with Mike, and she then falls off the wagon, really. She then goes into psychiatric hospital for inpatient treatment as she loses it all again. And we actually witness some brutal methods in the hospital that really alarm me. Shock therapy, for example, which I thought had been virtually outlawed, but apparently not. Because usually these methods actually worsen the voices in one's head's symptoms. The final moments moves to what appears to be calmness, a degree of normalcy. One might say that with Jane discharged back into the community, things were looking up. However, comparisons by the director are made between Jane and Alice with regard to friends that they know. In fact, Jane has more than Alice. And also, the script then pinpoints the issue of marital relationships and single relationships and the contrast. And of course, Alice is in a marriage, whereas Jane isn't. And we witness an incident when they're out together one day where Alice spots the family car and on closer inspection finds that her husband is having sex with a woman in the back of the car. And this creates quite an adverse reaction in Alice. And we then are asked really to consider, the impact of these very, very earth-shattering events on the mental psyche, and how different is Alice's reaction compared with what Jane's was when she was stood up, and the differences are very minimal. But Jane was considered to be psychiatrically ill, whereas Alice is just considered to be having been let down in a relationship. There are lots of eye-opening questions. I have to say, in conclusion, though, that the film is lifted to a higher level by the acting performances of Sally Hawkins. Her performance as Jane is quite remarkable, and it's a very good message to those who may well have the label of being mentally ill. And I would thoroughly recommend that you get to watch it. It's called Eternal Beauty, and it was released in 2020.